folks. You're popping up all over the place, and it's great to see you again. Here we are on Friday, the last day of this class. I don't know about you, but I'm going to sure miss this opportunity every afternoon to get together with you all and with Dr. Craig. It's been a marvelous privilege and a joy. So I hope you are all doing well. And without further ado, for our last day of class, Dr. Craig.
Thank you, David. Well, today we turn to chapter 11, which is part 2 of the evidence of archaeology concerning human origins. And today we want to look at archaeological evidence for symbolic behavior among early man. And you see on pages 302, 303, a pair of extremely early and recently discovered cave paintings. On the island of Borneo in Indonesia, a cave painting of a bull has been dated by uranium thorium testing of calcium carbonate deposits over the figure to more than 40,000 years ago. And in Sulawesi, Indonesia, we find the oldest known instance of figurative art depicting a scene with buffalo and pigs, which has been dated to a minimum age of 44,000 years ago. Older hand stencils have been identified in Maltrevieso cave in Spain, along with other instances of non-figurative paintings in La Pasiega and Ardales cave. And these have been dated to 66.7 thousand years ago and 64.8 thousand years ago, which predates the arrival of Homo sapiens in Europe by some 20,000 years. And so the implication is that they were made by Neanderthal artists. The archaeologist on one of these sites reflects on this on page 304. This cave painting activity constitutes a symbolic behavior by definition, and one that is deeply rooted. At Ardales, distinct episodes over a period of more than 25,000 years corroborate that we are not dealing with a one-off burst, but with a long tradition that may well stretch back to the time of the annular construction found in Brumichel Cave, France, dated to 176,000 years ago. Dating results for the excavation site at Cueva de los Aviones, Spain, which place symbolic use of marine shells and mineral pigments by Neanderthals at around 150,000 years ago, further supports the antiquity of Neanderthal symbolism. So we have good evidence for symbolic behavior now among Neanderthals. Hoffman, at the bottom of 304, concludes, the corollary of these findings is that the capacity for symbolism must have been inherited from a common ancestor. As a working hypothesis, we suggest that the origins of language and the advanced cognition characteristic of extant humans may precede the period before the divergence of the Neanderthal lineage more than 500,000 years ago. The second archaeological signature relevant to symbolic behavior is the use of pigment. And what we point out there is that particularly bright forms of pigment, like so-called spectacularite, were probably used for decorative purposes and not just for functional purposes like tanning hides. And these associations go back more than 300,000 years. On page 306 at the top of the page, you see the chronological attribution of the older pigments from Africa and their association with Lupemban stone tools dating to around 300,000 years ago seem to indicate that the use of pigments originated with Homo heidelbergensis, or archaic Homo sapiens, according to Francisco Derrico. So the use of pigment is also suggestive of symbolic behavior. Then next, we have the evidence concerning burial of the dead. And what is pointed out here is that a burial of the dead is actually more characteristic of Neanderthals than of Homo sapiens. I point out that of the 58 known Middle Paleolithic burial sites in Europe and the Near East, 35 belong to Neanderthals, and we have from this about 20 reasonably complete Neanderthal skeletons. And apart from intentional burial, it's difficult to understand why one would have these articulated entire skeletons remaining rather than just scattered bones. And so Derrico reports that there is, well, actually, this is from McBrady and Brooks, there is general agreement that most, if not all, relatively complete Neanderthal skeletons were deliberately interred. I also point out that there were sometimes artifacts that were interred with the bodies, which could indicate a deeper belief in perhaps life beyond the grave or some sort of ritual significance. We don't know, but it is clear that Neanderthals were treating their dead in a way that's vastly different than the way animals treat carcasses or the way Neanderthals would have treated the carcasses of animals that they consumed. We then come to language, and here I quote the 19th century philologist Max Muller, who declared the one great barrier between the brute and man is language. Man speaks, and no brute has ever uttered a word. Language is the Rubicon, and no brute will dare to cross it. Language can be thought of as a symbolic and freely extensible communication system, and speech as the externalization of language in sound. And the extensive studies that have been carried out on so-called animal communication systems bear out Muller's judgment. The key thing to understand about animal signaling is that it has no referentiality. The sounds made by animals are not words that have reference to things. They're simply cries that alert other animals of that species to, for example, the danger of predators. But they aren't words that refer to these predators. The ability to refer to something is characteristic of language and is unique to human beings. Even chimpanzees who have been trained over and over again do not master genuine referential language usage. For example, when the chimp can press a button indicating that it wants a banana with a picture of the banana on the button, it doesn't have any idea that it is referring to a banana. It's just been conditioned by response reward training that is simply functioning referentially to get the desired benefit, but it isn't really a manifestation of symbolic behavior and reference. Now, the difficulty, of course, is how in the world do you detect language ability in these primeval men? Well, first, we consider anatomical clues. And I point out that a large brain size in a hominin is a prerequisite for language ability. and the presence of a large brain increases the probability of linguistic ability. So Roger Lewin and Robert Foley state that once a hominin brain size exceeds 1,000 cubic centimeters, there's little doubt that linguistic capabilities existed and that therefore language was probably present at least in Neanderthals. They say, and I quote, "Given their large brains, there is little doubt that Neanderthals are intelligent, flexible hominins, even if there may have been some differences between them and modern humans." Now, in addition to mere brain size, however, the brain organization is crucial. And linguistic ability is associated with certain areas of the brain which are shown by endocasts to have been lacking in Australopithecines and primitive Homo species of that sort. So what evidence might there be for language ability? Well, consider the supralaryngeal vocal tract of chimpanzees and early man. Basically, what is pointed out here is that some have been skeptical in virtue of the shape of the supralaryngeal vocal tract in Neanderthals, that their speech would be as articulate as our speech today. In particular, skepticism has been expressed that they could articulate clearly the so-called quantal vowels. These are vowels that have very little overlap in their sounds, as you can see in the chart on page 318. And so quantal vowels are very helpful for articulate speech because they're less easily confused with each other. And the claim here is that Neanderthals did not have a supralaryngeal vocal tract that would have enabled them to articulate well these quantal vowels. But does that mean that they did not have speech? Well, no, not at all. If you look on page 317, Lieberman does not draw the inference that therefore they lacked speech. He says, does this mean that Neanderthals lacked speech and language? Probably not. The archaeological record indicates that they had some form of language and speech. The general level of Neanderthal culture is such that this limited phonetic ability was probably utilized and that some form of language existed. Indeed, speech must have been in place in archaic hominids ancestral to humans and Neanderthals, that is, Homo sapiens and Neanderthals. There would have been no selective advantage for retaining mutations that yielded the species-specific human speech-producing anatomy at the cost of increased morbidity from choking unless speech was already present. So even Lieberman is saying that in the ancestors of Neanderthals and Homo sapiens, you already have to have linguistic ability. Now, this linguistic ability may have been less articulate than ours, so that their speech wouldn't have been able to distinguish these quantal vowels. But here is a very interesting illustration of this on page 319. The speech of little children furnishes a wonderful illustration here. Children do not arrive at an adult configuration of their supralaryngeal vocal tract until ages 6 to 8. As children age, the tongue pushes back into the throat and descends so that the supralaryngeal vocal tract actually expands and reaches the adult proportions by around 8 years of age. Now, Lieberman observes that children whose SVTs have not yet reached adult proportion do speak, he says, often well, but because their format frequencies are not as quantal, perception errors by listeners are higher. Now, when I read this, I thought, I wonder how my grandson, Ollie, would do with his quantal vowels. And so one day on the telephone, talking to my daughter, I said, put Ollie on the phone. And I said, Ollie, say your ABCs to me. And he rattled off his ABCs without effort. And he was easily able to pronounce the E sounds like B, C, D, E, and also the U sounds like Q, W, U. He had perfect mastery of those quantal vowels. And so you may have noticed the dedication of my book way back at the beginning. If you turn to the dedication page, the book is dedicated to our grandson, Oliver, whose quantal vowels would be the envy of any Neanderthal. When the editor at Erdman saw that dedication, he said, this is the best book dedication I have ever seen in my life. So we shouldn't think that there are significant obstacles to Neanderthal speech that would arise from the structure of their supralaryngeal vocal tract. On page 320, I quote from Dan DiDio and Stephen Levinson. They say language affords culture carrying capacities. For example, there are no advanced technologies without language. And this linkage allows reasonable inferences from the archaeological record. Therefore, we think it is overwhelmingly likely that Neanderthals were as much articulate beings as we ourselves are. That is, with large vocabularies and combinatorial structures that allowed propositional content and illocutionary force to be conveyed. Only such an advanced communication system could have carried the advanced cultural adaptations that Neanderthals exhibited. If one considers all the cultural skills needed to survive in ecologies from the Arctic to game-poor Mediterranean littorals, it is difficult to argue that Neanderthals lacked complex linguistic codes capable of communicating about spatial locations, hunting and gathering, fauna and flora, social relations, technologies, and so on. This would imply a large lexicon and propositional encoding, granting Neanderthals advanced language capacities seems to us inevitable. Well, are there any other anatomical clues to language capacity in Neanderthals? Well, you'll remember our discussion of the arterial foramina, which are indicative of increased brain metabolism in Neanderthals, which is consistent with the capacity for speech. I then also look at the so-called hyperglossal canal through which nerves controlling the tongue pass, and show that the Neanderthals had a canal that would be sufficient for speech. Additional anatomical evidence comes from enlarged thoracic vertebral canal in human beings, through which pass the nerves that control the muscles used to regulate breathing. And on page 322, I quote Anne McLarnon and Gwen Hewitt to the effect that human language requires extended exhalations for vocalizations and increased control of volume, emphasis, and intonation compared with non-human primates, and therefore presumably compared with early hominins. Such features require fast, intricate, flexible, and integrated neural control of intercostal and abdominal muscles. And they point out that this kind of thoracic vertebral canal cannot be found in Australopithecus or Homo erectus, but it is found in Neanderthals and early Homo sapiens, as well as in modern humans. So they then examine the possible explanations for this increased thoracic innervation, such as bipedalism, increased difficulty of giving birth, respiration for endurance running, and so forth. And what they argue is that none of these explanations is as plausible as saying that this increased thoracic innervation was necessary for the muscle control to produce human speech. Human speech is unique in the fine respiratory control required for its production. So they conclude on page 323, Neanderthals and early modern humans had expanded thoracic innervation like extant humans. It seems most probable that this increased innervation evolved to enable enhanced breath control, and the most likely functional reason for this was the evolution of human speech, that is, the physical production of language. And then finally, I consider genetic clues. I've already mentioned the revolution in paleoanthropology as a result of the sequencing of the Neanderthal genome. And what has emerged as a result of this is that there has been significant interbreeding between Neanderthals, Denisovans, and Homo sapiens. And just the fact of interbreeding alone carries implications for capacity for speech. In order to have the sort of social organization that would be required for mating and raising children, where you have one parent, a Neanderthal, and the other parent, a Homo sapiens, would likely require linguistic ability between the partners and then in the children. I've also mentioned earlier the gene ARHGAP11B and the Notch2 NL genes in the lineage leading up to Neanderthals, Homo sapiens, and Denisovans, which contributed significantly to their brain growth. Now, we don't know if either of those is connected with language ability as well as significant brain growth. But there are certain genes that are connected with linguistic ability, and one of these would be the FOXP2 gene, which is connected with speech. FOXP2 seems to be necessary for human speech. And while FOXP2 in human beings differs significantly from that of humans and gorillas in two crucial amino acid coding positions, this gene is found to be identical in Homo sapiens and Neanderthals. At the top of 326, I point out that Neanderthal and Homo sapiens FOXP2 is identical in the very two positions, position 911 and 977 in exon 7, that differ from ape FOXP2. And in this respect, then at least, Neanderthals and Homo sapiens would share any linguistic capacity that these genetic changes in FOXP2 would convey. So I then give a lengthy summary of all the archaeological evidence, which suggests that humanity originated on this planet sometime prior to the divergence of Neanderthals and Homo sapiens. Let me ask if is there any discussion at this point concerning this archaeological evidence?
No questions have been typed into the chat so far, but if anyone wants to interject.
Well, why don't we take then our 5-minute break,
Okay.
and then if there are questions when we come back, we can address them initially.
Okay, so we'll get to your question, Dan, when we come back. 5 minutes.
Hey, Dr. Craig.
Yeah.
Hey, unfortunately, I have to hop off.
Okay.
Say thank you for all your time this week.
Oh,
It's been a real treat, and looking forward to digging more into the book. I actually wanted to tell you something. I came to faith through your ministry about 10 years ago,
wow.
and I was getting my undergraduate degree at the time, and I was pursuing a business degree. But once I stumbled upon your work, I began skipping my classes to head to the library and watch your debates and go through your Defender series. And I would take copious notes. And I actually began skipping my assignments in school as well in order to write.
Yeah, I was a bad influence on you.
Yes, a horrible influence. I began writing some theology papers and my own personal doctrinal statements and things I never expected anyone to read. But my wife and I just last year moved here to Las Vegas to start a church. And so that's just one fruit of your ministry. So I wanted to say thank you.
Oh, and are you there in Las Vegas now?
Yeah, we moved from
Wow.
Phoenix a year ago. And actually, this Sunday, we're celebrating our 1-year anniversary.
Oh,
of the
tremendous.
church.
That's wonderful.
Yeah.
Well, I hope that the Lord really prospers your work there.
Thank you. Yeah. And thanks again for your time. And I've
Sure.
really enjoyed listening to my classmates here add value to the course. So bye, all. Thanks.
Bye, Tyler.
Hi, Tyler. Dr. Craig, contributing to dropouts for the last 30 years. No, I'm just kidding.
What's that?
Oh, I was just making a joke. Dr. Craig, contributing to school dropouts for the last 30 years.
Yeah, that is, I've never heard that before. That is strange.
Well, it's great. I'm using Dr. Craig's material with high school students and in a very secular, a Christian school, but in a very secular culture here in Australia. And it's great for students who have really hard hearts to Christianity. They just think it's a bunch of nonsense, or it's just silly or implausible. And you suddenly start presenting arguments, and they suddenly start their ears to prick up. And I had one girl come up to me, one of our 12th grade girls, who's one of our best students, incredibly intelligent, and she just said, "This has just been amazing. Like how her mind has been expanded." She said, "I really need to think about this whole Christianity thing a little bit more." So it's fantastic, Dr. Craig, to have your resources there. It's great. I've shown your debates to students as well, and it's a real blessing to have such quality material from you. So on the back of Tyler, thank you.
Oh, that's really heartwarming and just so gratifying.
Well, 4:04.
Okay, shall we resume?
Yeah.
So I did want to give folks an opportunity to raise any points of discussion before we proceed.
2 questions so far. First from Dan.
Yeah. All right. Great. So I get to speak again. So look, I'm not even real too sure what to ask here about this stuff because it's just so unfamiliar and new to me. But I guess my question is, Dr. Craig, what have people, or if anything, scientists who are expert in this field of paleoanthropology and that sort of thing, has there been any response to your proposal that Homo heidelbergensis are really human, like they have all the characteristics of human? Is that something that's generally accepted? Has there been pushback? Is it just nothing?
You know, this is so new. You understand the book only came out in September. So the only thing so far is Stephen Schaffner's review in Science. And he doesn't raise any objection to that identification. He commends me for my openness to follow the science where it leads and to use science to try to identify the origins of humanity. But that's as far as he goes. So no, there hasn't been any scholarly reaction yet.
Okay. We'll wait and we'll see.
Oh, I'm very anxious, eager to see. So, I mean, there'll be 2 types of reaction corresponding to the 2 parts of the book. There'll be one from biblical scholars, particularly Old Testament scholars, and then there'll be one from scientists. And I'm really very eager to hear from both of them.
And are you intending to engage in any dialogue sorts of
Yes, indeed.
You know, like I would love to see you in a conversation with a creation scientist, for example, to thrash out, both parts of the book, or with someone like Jerry Coyne. I think that would be pretty fun to watch. So.
Yeah, that would be interesting. Well, yes, in November, around November 18, at the Evangelical Theological Society meeting in Dallas-Fort Worth, I will be on a panel responding to 4 critics or respondents to the book. And they include both biblical scholars and one scientist, a woman from University of California, Berkeley. And she says, I have never done anything like this before in my life. I've never gone to a theological conference. So she's really looking forward to the interaction. And I'm anxious to hear what they have to say. And then also next spring, I think around April, Ken Keithley, who is a theologian at Southeastern Baptist Theological Seminary, has a grant from the Templeton Foundation to sponsor a workshop on human origins. And this will feature me, Josh Swamidas, and several others who have written and worked in this area. So that promises to be a very fruitful time of interaction.
Great, thank you.
Okay, Michael.
Thanks, Dr. Craig. Just to piggyback on Dan's comment real quickly, I just listened to the latest Reasonable Faith podcast, and I think it was Jerry Coyne. His comments, I think he mentioned, made it clear that he hasn't even read your book yet. So if you're going to enter into a dialogue, that might be a necessary precondition.
Yes, one would think so.
I'm auditing, and so for work and other commitments, I may have a gap that this is asked, but my question was about the cave painting evidence, and I was just curious from if one wanted to hold to a young Earth creationist perspective, how would you see would be the strongest way to deny or try to escape some of that evidence? Would you how would you try to deny the evidence of the cave painting with the calcium deposit and the uranium thorium dating? Would you try to deny the efficacy of that dating? Would you claim that it's a non-human primate perhaps that painted it? I was just curious how you would deal.
I think I think both of them are lost causes. In order for all of these dating methods to be so wrong, they would all have to be off by like 99+%, which just seems incredibly improbable, not to mention the very fact that there are dating methods that aren't connected with the decay of elements, things like the rate at which stalagmites form or coral reefs that are found that are fossilized. The fact that we can see the light from distant stars, just these indications of age everywhere, I think make it really, really impossible, plausibly, to deny the great antiquity of the world and of man in particular. But I think it's equally implausible to think that paintings like the ones I've shown you pictures of could have been produced by non-human beasts. I think when you have aesthetic, symbolic capacity, you are surely in touch with humanity. And remember the point that I made, that if you deny the humanity of those people who exhibited this kind of cognitive behavior, you could deny the humanity of people living today who exhibit similar cognitive behavior. And I think here of the hateful sort of propaganda that, for example, Muslims have sometimes put out about Jews, comparing them to apes, or Charles Darwin's own view that African Blacks are closer to gorillas on the evolutionary tree than they are to Caucasian Europeans. That is so morally unconscionable that it makes me completely resistant to writing Neanderthals and other primitive hominins out of the human race. I think it literally is a kind of racism.
Yeah, that makes sense to me. I if you can permit one more follow on, you've interacted most with Joshua Swamidas from what I've seen, at least from what I've been able to watch. How would he interact with this, with the postulation of other populations outside the garden? Is that how he would deal with the appearance of age and things? It's hard for me to tell sometimes because he spends a lot of time trying to make room.
yeah, for Josh, he is fully committed to the standard scientific paradigm of the world, the Big Bang Theory, the theory of biological evolution, and so forth. So he believes that outside the Garden of Eden, there was a population of hominins who had evolved from our ancestors with the great apes, and who bore the genetic signatures of those ape-like progenitors. And he thinks that when Adam and Eve were expelled from the garden, Adam and Eve were created de novo out of the dust of the earth and the rib from Adam's side. They didn't evolve, but when they were expelled from the garden, their children and descendants began to interbreed with these hominins that had evolved from our ancestors with apes. And that's why the contemporary human population exhibits that kind of genetic divergence and those traces and similarities to chimpanzees that genetic scientists identify. And so Josh will disagree with me hermeneutically that Adam and Eve were the universal progenitors of human beings. That's the real sticking point on which we disagree. I am adamant that Adam and Eve are the sole progenitors of every human being on this planet, and Josh disagrees with that. And so we dialogue about it, we debate about it, and you'll have to decide where you think the truth lies.
Thank you.
Okay, Daniel.
Yeah, Dr. Craig, this answer may have gotten fleshed out and I just missed it, but I was wondering, going back to animal communication being conditioned versus referential, do we know this by observation of the animals, or is it more of the anatomical limitations? Like, for example, a baboon in a tree that sees a panther and lets out a cry to warn the other baboons. How do we know that that cry is a conditioned response and not a referential one to the panther that it sees?
Yeah, it would be based upon behavioral studies of these animals, and particularly the massive effort that has gone into trying to teach chimpanzees linguistic ability. Chimps are thought to be the closest to us biologically and to be the most intelligent of the primates. And if they can't get linguistic ability, then neither can vervet monkeys or baboons or other more primitive primates. So it would be based upon basically these kinds of behavioral studies.
Okay, great.
All right, Dr. Craig, Fred has a question about that panel coming up.
Yeah, I was wondering if you can you let us in on who will be on that discussion, or is that still?
Yes. Now, Ken Keithley is the moderator, and then there will be Michael Murray, who was for a long time with the John Templeton Foundation and is a very significant player in the contemporary dialogue between science and religion. He's currently now working for the Arthur Vining Davis Foundation. So in addition to Michael Murray, then there's going to be John Collins, the Old Testament professor from Concordia. Nice. And then there's going to be this fellow that I don't really know, Hans Maneume, something like that. And he may be the young earth creationist on the panel, but he is a biblical scholar as well. And then there is this University of California paleoanthropologist whose name I forget, and she will be the only distaff member of the panel. So those are the folks that will be on it.
Sweet.
Yeah. Well, shall we proceed to the next chapter, which is called Locating the Historical Adam. And here I offer my hypothesis that Adam and Eve were members of the ever mysterious Homo heidelbergensis. And I describe how this fossil was originally found. I point out on page 331 that Homo heidelbergensis is a truly cosmopolitan hominin species, which may lie at the origin of European and African lineages that eventually led to Neanderthals and Homo sapiens. The origin of Homo heidelbergensis is shrouded in antiquity. He may have originated in either Asia or Europe or Africa. Any of those places could have been the place of his origin. And then he migrated to these other regions, and members of this lineage then evolved into Neanderthals and Homo sapiens. When did this occur? Well, I point out on page 331 that in 1999, the best estimates were that this divergence between Neanderthals and Homo sapiens occurred somewhere between 741 and 317,000 years ago, and that based on a more complete genome analysis since then, the divergence is now dated somewhere around 765,000 to 555,000 years ago. And you can see that on the chart on page 332, which illustrates the lineage of Neanderthals, Denisovans, and Homo sapiens, and the times of their divergences. I then point out that Homo heidelbergensis is associated with quite a number of the archaeological signatures of modern behavior listed on pages 334 and 335. And I won't review these since we've already talked about them. So I love this quotation on 336 from Richard Fortey. He says, the tendencies toward large brain size were carried further, while the social habits, tool making, and all the paraphernalia attached to hunting and gathering tribes were added piece by piece until you could say of the creature standing before you, Ecce homo, behold the man. Pilate's words about Jesus to the crowd in Jerusalem, Ecce homo. So I say that Adam can be plausibly identified as a member of Homo heidelbergensis, perhaps around or before 750,000 years ago. He may have even lived in the Near East in the biblical site of the Garden of Eden. That's perfectly plausible, although obviously much earlier than traditionally thought. His descendants migrated southward into Africa, where they gave rise to Homo sapiens, and westward into Europe, where they evolved into Neanderthals and Denisovans. And then once Homo sapiens began to migrate out of Africa around 130,000 years ago, these separate lines of their descendants began to interbreed with each other. I then discussed two different models of how this transition to humanity may have occurred. One model envisions a dramatic regulatory mutation that may not have been huge in terms of the DNA, but in terms of the genes controlled by this regulatory mutation, it could have resulted in vastly increased cognitive capacity and humanity. The other view is that it was through the pressures of cultural development that human intelligence emerged and came to be. And what I point out on 337 is that these two views are obviously not mutually exclusive. We can imagine a scenario in which a regulatory mutation, perhaps divinely caused, a miracle, occurs in a member or members of a population belonging to Homo heidelbergensis, effecting a change in the functioning of the brain that results in a significantly increased cognitive capacity. Some behavioral outworkings of this increased cognitive capacity would be immediate, but others would emerge slowly over time among this person's descendants through what is called niche construction and gene cultural evolution through the pressure of cultural development. Thus, we're to imagine, in line with the cultural model, that both Neanderthals and Homo sapiens are heirs to the cognitive capacity for modern behaviors already present in Homo heidelbergensis, and in line with the mutational model that this increased cognitive capacity is itself the result of a crucial mutation in some ancestral individual belonging to Homo heidelbergensis. I then consider challenges to the idea that the entire human race could have descended from a primordial human pair. And the principal challenge to this has come from population genetics. And I rehearse here a number of arguments that have been offered to show that the human population could never have been reduced to a bottleneck of only 2 individuals, that there were always thousands of human beings in the past, going back to the time of their emergence as a population. So on page 346, I quote Dennis Venema, a Christian biologist who expresses his supreme confidence that humanity did not descend from a single human couple. I quote, "Some ideas in science are so well supported that it is highly unlikely new evidence will substantially modify them. And these are among them. The sun is at the center of our solar system. Humans evolved, and we evolved as a population," end quote. He here expresses what has been called heliocentric certainty against an original human pair. And I want to emphasize, especially for Ben's sake, that the thrust of my book and the purpose of this research is not to refute young Earth creationists. It is to respond to revisionists and secularists like Venema, who say that in light of modern science, we now have to abandon belief in a literal Adam and Eve, and treat them as non-existent. And so the thrust of this book is to defend the historicity of Adam and Eve against people like Dennis Venema and Scott McKnight in their book, Adam and the Genome. So I then offer criticisms of Venema's arguments, which I am not going to go into. You can read them on your own. But basically what I point out is that so long as this primordial human couple lived more than 500,000 years ago, the evidence of population genetics is powerless to disprove that such a bottleneck existed. At best, it could detect it only if it were within the last 500,000 years. Now, since wholly independently of the data of population genetics, I had already reached the conclusion that Adam and Eve lived prior to 500,000 years ago as the ancestors of Neanderthals and Homo sapiens. This challenge of population genetics just completely dissolved for my model. So on page 353, I point out that after extended discussion with Richard Buggs, Josh Swamidas, and others, Venema came to acknowledge the failure of his arguments against a single couple origin. Quote, based on some new simulations and some other published studies that we drew on, our group came to an agreement that if an event like this had happened, we would be able to detect it. And here, this is a misunderstanding by Venema. He should say we would be able to detect it only if it happened more recently than 500,000 years ago, not if. He confuses necessary and sufficient conditions, which those of you who are philosophy students will know is an absolutely crucial distinction. So what they came to conclude was that we would be able to detect this bottleneck only if it happened more recently than 500,000 years ago. Venema says that was surprising to me, to be sure. I thought beforehand that an event like this would show up even further back in time. The fact of the matter is that population genetics just does not pose a significant challenge to the existence of Adam and Eve on my model. I then, on page 356, consider a geographical challenge, namely, how could the descendants of Adam and Eve spread throughout the entire world if at one time there were only two people alive? And again, what I simply point out is that given their deep antiquity, there's simply no problem, given human migration, that in 750,000 years or less, their descendants would in fact fill every corner of the globe, so that there is no geographic challenge either. So on the basis of the scientific evidence, my model, my hypothesis is that Adam and Eve were members of the species Homo heidelbergensis, or I would say at least to that species, that large-brained species that is ancestral to Neanderthals and Homo sapiens, and that this is fully consistent with the contemporary evidence of population genetics. Any discussion about that hypothesis or model?
Yes. Rick and Dan, will come back to you. Marcus.
Yeah, thank you. So Dr. Craig, you mentioned about the plausibility of identifying Adam as a member of Homo heidelbergensis. I was wondering, what evidence do you think would be needed to go beyond mere plausibility into a likely sort of likelihood or highly likely, or what are your thoughts on that?
I think what you'd have to show, Marcus, is that the hominin ancestors of Homo heidelbergensis did not exhibit this kind of cognitive capacity. For example, if Homo erectus is all you've got prior to Homo heidelbergensis, then I'd say that really increases the probability that Adam and Eve belong to Homo heidelbergensis. But the problem is the origins of Homo heidelbergensis are shrouded in antiquity. If you look at the evolutionary chart I showed you, we don't know where they came from. Recently, there has been a sister species to Homo heidelbergensis called Homo antecessor, which is very interesting. This human species has a thoroughly modern face, looks like us, and yet is as old as Homo heidelbergensis. So I fully anticipate that there are going to be revisions and more refining of this hypothesis in the coming years.
Thank you. Thank you.
I point out that although the hypothesis is provisional, the good thing about it is this archaeological data tends to be really basic. I mean, it's not very revisable. I mean, the constructions in Bruniquel Cave aren't going to go away. These Neanderthal cave paintings aren't going to vanish. So given the low theoretical level of archaeology, these results are not like high level physics, which are dependent upon theoretical models that can be easily revised. So I think that the change that we can anticipate will probably be simply to push human origins further back. But I don't think they're going to plausibly make it more recent in light of the depth of these archaeological signatures that we already have.
Okay. Leonard.
Dr. Craig, I was thinking a bit about the implications of Adam being Homo heidelbergensis. I was wondering if it would be possible for Adam or Eve to have brothers or sisters, even if not truly human, but still be like they share parents, say it in that ancestor way. I'm trying to avoid the human language there, but would it be possible for Adam and Eve to have non-human brothers and sisters, I guess?
Yes,
Yeah.
It seems to me that's not something you can rule out. Yeah, it's possible.
Okay, just curious about that. Thank you.
Okay, Ben.
Hey, Dr. Craig. In regards to your comment earlier, just a single response. I think young Earth creationism should be included in the acceptable range of opinion, and that's my only goal here.
What should be?
Young Earth creationism, I think it should be included in the acceptable range of opinion. And my impression is that we're treated like flat earthers and disrespected. And
Yes.
that impacts our ability to do things like get hired in scientific fields, to get money for research, and
Yes.
things that we need to advance our paradigm. So
Have
that's all
you-
Go ahead. What?
Have you read the book yet, Ben?
Your book?
Yes.
Of course I have.
Okay. Well, there are many auditors, you see, who don't even have the book. And so I just wanted to ask if you had read it, because I made a real effort in this book to include young Earth creationists as dialogue partners in this debate. While I regard the claim of creation science as preposterous and not a plausible alternative, I regard the hermeneutical claim of young Earth creationism with deadly seriousness and think it has to be on the table. And so you'll find in the footnotes, I'm interacting with Jonathan Sarfati's commentary on Genesis. I treat him just as I would Richard Averback or Victor Hamilton or Klaus Westermann as a significant dialogue partner. And I should tell you, one of the things that I did after my book was accepted in press is I proposed a 4 views book on the historical Adam and asked Ken Keithley if he would be the editor, and I would represent the ancient genealogical Adam view. Andrew Loke would represent the recent genealogical Adam view. Kenton Sparks, who's in your Halton book you're reading, would represent the non-historical view. And then I insisted there has to be a young Earth creationist involved in this book. This is one of the 4 views that needs to be included. And I'll tell you, Ben, I had a terrible time finding any young Earth creationist who would agree to participate. When I approached Jonathan Sarfati, the paranoia was unbelievable. They thought that it was a conspiracy to embarrass them, that Ken Keithley, they resented him as the editor. They thought that Ken would write in the introduction to the book things deriding their point of view and would sabotage it. And I said, look, you can approve anything or disapprove it that Ken writes in the introduction of the book. I'll submit it to you for your approval. They still wouldn't do it. And I said, well, how about this? You write the introduction on your view, and we'll include it with what Ken says about the other views, but you write it. they still wouldn't do it. The paranoia was just thick, that they wouldn't participate in the book. And so I turned to Kurt Wise instead. I thought, well, Kurt Wise is a scientifically credible person who could be in the book. And the response I got from him was indignant and abrupt, and said, why would I participate in a book that calls into question the word of God, and, you know, and so forth. And so we finally settled on someone that that Ken Keithley knew, that I think may be a professor at Liberty or maybe at Southeastern. But I've got to tell you, Ben, I've made a real effort to include the young earth creationists in this debate, and it's not been easy.
Well, I appreciate that, but what I am looking for is an acknowledgement that we should not be discriminated against in scientific fields because of our views.
I just haven't spoken to that either way. I mean, I understand what you're saying, that people who hold maverick positions are often discriminated. I remember in cosmology, the area I'm more familiar with, Halton Arp was a cosmologist who called into question the Big Bang model and the explanation of the redshift. And he found it very difficult to get telescope time, because the people who control these great telescopes, this is precious. This time is so precious to accord to observational astronomers, and they felt it would be just wasting it to let ARP have telescope time to pursue his maverick hypotheses. So you have to make a decision, you know, is that right or is it not right? And I haven't spoken to that at all, Ben. I've not said anything about it. It's not my place.
Okay, well, I'm being prompted to ask my regular questions. So I'm actually really interested in your views on how you think God guided mutations. And I guess the main thing I'm not worried about, wanting to know is, do you think that there is a distinction between the mutations that God causes to bring about his evolutionary plan, and mutations that are not part of the plan?
Okay.
Or do you think he sets, like, you see what I'm saying? Like
yes, I do.
Expert, like billiards player at the beginning, or does he intervene in the process?
Well, let me make it clear to everybody that I am not advocating the scenario that I just described to you. I'm saying, here's a possibility. Here's a scenario that would be fully compatible with evolutionary biology, but I'm not advocating that. I'm just defending its plausibility or possibility. And the scenario that I propose does envision a miraculous intervention of God at some time in the historical process, not just setting up the initial conditions and letting them unfold. I do believe that God is provident over the whole of human history. As someone who believes in what is called divine middle knowledge, I think that God is in control of every motion of every subatomic particle in the history of the universe. But he does so without necessarily needing to intervene causally in the nexus of secondary causes. But the proposal that I'm offering here is that we can imagine that God did intervene somewhere around 750,000 years ago to cause this genetic regulatory mutation that lifted these two hominins to full humanity, and as I'll say later, infused into them rational souls that made them fully human. So I'm quite happy with miracles.
Okay, one last follow-up.
Okay, this needs to be the last one.
It will. So evolutionists, what they do is they observe mutations in the lab or in nature, and they say, we're going to extrapolate these mutations that we're observing today into the past, and that's the cause of evolutionary change.
Yeah.
So if you're saying that God is intervening in the past to cause specific mutations, that's not the same mechanism that is observed today in nature or in the lab. And so you can't make a scientific extrapolation from today's mutations to the kinds you're talking about, unless you're saying God's guiding mutations in the lab today
Oh,
when we're
no.
doing experiments and stuff like
Well,
that.
what I'm envisioning here would be this theistic evolution scenario where God would intervene to produce a miraculous mutation. And I think that that kind of intervention is so rare that it wouldn't serve to overthrow the scientific paradigm. I think that the paradigm would still be in place, even if there were in the past these sorts of singular miraculous interventions.
Okay, Hunter.
Hey, Dr. Craig. Yeah, I'm just having some trouble with understanding, I guess. And I know you've gone over it. And I know my question's similar to Dan's. But if you're talking about, if there's a plenitude of Homo heidelbergensis living, and Adam and Eve evolved out of that, wouldn't you say that, like, how would you overcome those population genetics when you say that they're progenitors of all mankind, that Adam and Eve are the progenitors of all mankind? Because wouldn't those other Homo heidelbergensis, wouldn't they also reproduce and develop rationality and things of that sort?
No,
you can
no,
just flesh
not
that out.
necessarily. I'm thinking here of a time in the distant past at the very origin of Homo heidelbergensis, so that their companions, say they live in a tribe of hominins, that the other members of their tribe would not be human beings, that they would be the sole human beings, and then their children and descendants would be human, and these others wouldn't. And eventually these others die out over time. The descendants of Adam and Eve evolve into Homo sapiens and Neanderthals, and these others just die out.
Okay, that's where I was
extinct.
getting confusion. It's at the beginning of that.
Yeah.
these
Yeah,
African species.
yeah. I mean, we don't know when, obviously.
I got you. Thank you.
One more question, Fred.
Hey, Dr. Craig. I might be getting ahead. I just figured it was the last day. So in Defenders, you talk about different views of the origins of the soul, and one of the views you say that I think you said you're open to it is emergentism by Bill Hasker. So I'm wondering, would Adam and Eve, would that be compatible with them, or only with their children? Because it would seem that maybe Adam and Eve would have to be like special kids of their parents, where they have a certain complexity,
Yeah. Oh, I mean, I talk about this in the last chapter. I had always sort of envisioned that this change in them would be a miraculous change in them as adults, or at least teenagers. But it might be the case that this genetic mutation actually took place in embryo, in the womb. Or it could have been a genetic mutation, not in Adam and Eve as such, but in the gametes, the sperm and the egg, which then united to form them, so that right from the very beginning, they were human. And that genetic mutation had already lifted them to the status of humanity at the moment of conception. So they would be what geneticists call genetically modified organisms. You heard of things like genetically modified wheat or tomatoes. Adam and Eve would be genetically modified organisms. So that's a possibility. These are all speculations. But that would work. And then I I think as they grow up and they have this increased cognitive capacity, the question that Hasker's model poses is, maybe this genetic regulatory mutation in their brain and central nervous system is sufficient for the soul then to emerge. I mean, I'm not an expert on this area, but I could see where emergentism would fit really nice into such a scenario.
Thank you.
Maybe one more quick question, Dan.
Yeah, so my question's a follow-up to Hunter's around how we're to picture Adam and Eve evolving as Homo heidelbergensis. So my understanding of evolution is that populations evolve, not individuals. So Richard Dawkins has a nice little picture of this in one of his books about science, where he imagines a long picture of say rabbits, and every rabbit looks basically the same as its parent rabbit, and you follow along the line and every one looks very similar to the one before it. But if you look, say 1 million years apart, they look quite different because these changes accumulate over time. But what it sounds like here is it seems to seem like there's actually quite a radical or a significant change between the parents of Adam and Eve and as you said there earlier, to their siblings.
Yes.
So is this some sort of like mega evolution, or is it like a miraculous intervention?
Well,
here?
I said it may well have been miraculous, yes. But you remember I talked about the two models, the cultural model and the mutational model. And Ian Tattersall of the American Museum of Natural History offers a mutational model of the origin of humanity, where there is a dramatic genetic mutation in a regulatory system that has then these huge results in their brain and central nervous system. So this could happen. Now, what's important to see, I think, is that there's a real fallacy in the reasoning of Dawkins here. And this is the same critique that Schaffner and Coyne also make. My model is perfectly consistent with saying that there is this long evolutionary climb toward humanity and then beyond, to Neanderthals and Homo sapiens. But what I am saying is that there is a threshold which is crossed somewhere in that process. And that is because evolutionary change is not continuous. It is continual. It goes on, but it's not continuous in the sense in which a geometrical line is continuous. Namely, between any 2 points, there's always another point. So no point has an immediate successor. What's striking about evolution is that the change is discrete, not continuous. That's the fallacy of the rabbit diagram. Between any 2 rabbits, there is not another rabbit. There are rabbits that are immediate successors of each other or predecessors, and therefore, given discrete evolutionary changes, there's no reason to think that one of these forms is the first one across the threshold, and that prior to that, it was subhuman. So I was talking to Jeff Schloss, who is an evolutionary biologist, committed to the theory of evolution, though a Christian. And as we spoke, he said to me, I don't see how there could not have been a first human being. At some point in the past, there were 0 human beings, and then later there were some. And given that evolutionary change is discrete, he said, I frankly don't understand how there could not be a first human being. So I think this critique by Schaffner and Coyne is invalid.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I mean, this is one where I struggle. Like, I would probably class myself as a an evolutionary creationist or somewhere around there, and this is the struggle, not just for humans, but the evolution of any organism. You know, I think is what you're kind of referring to there similar to punctuated equilibrium, the idea of rapid spurts of evolution, or is it a bit, what you're saying, a bit different to that?
It doesn't need to be that. I mean, this is a point that Tattersall makes in the book where I quote him. He says, I'm not saying that you have to be a 19th century saltationist. That is to say that evolution proceeds by fits and jumps. As long as the change is discrete, Dan, there can be someone who is the first one across that threshold. That is the difference between non-human and human. And it could come about because of something like a regulatory mutation that produces this change.
Okay, good. I'll have to think about it. Thank you.
Okay, maybe, well, we'll go for a couple more minutes and then take a break and come back for our last half hour. Anybody else?
Nope.
All right, then we'll take our break now and come back in 5 minutes, and we'll, in the words of the final chapter title, put it all together.
Dr. Craig, I had a question about something regarding time and some theological implications, if you wouldn't mind indulging me.
Go ahead.
Sure. So last night, as my wife was falling asleep on the couch, the YouTube algorithm knew to show me the discussion you were having with Jimmy Akin.
Oh, yeah.
On Kalam, and so of course I decided not to sleep and I watched that instead. And I got caught up on the second objection he had to your first argument, that you cannot have an infinite quantity of things.
Yeah.
And he said that the state in which God exists is a state where he has a single thought, but that single thought has an infinite quantity, namely an infinite number of future events. He said that God hasn't just created 2021, he's created 2022, 2023 ad infinitum. You know, barring the temporal becoming and those not being real things side of things, I thought about it from a theological standpoint, his approach that he took to most of the points you made. And I thought that maybe this just doesn't check out theologically, because the eschatological finale of the world is not an indeterminate expansion and indeterminate age, but Christ returns at some point and does bring an end to things. He judges the world and even creates a new heaven and a new earth. And I thought, well, it seems the only escape that he would have is in some sort of understanding of what he has after that new heaven and earth come about. But you know, if our time, the timeline that he refers to, is contingent upon this reality, and if heaven and earth is referring to the same thing in Genesis as the totality of reality, then it seems that timeline would end. And so that got me thinking about two things. You know, one, would that be sort of like a theological barrier in that objection he makes? And secondly, what are your thoughts on time post the second coming? Are we back into some sort of God's time, like prior to creation?
Yes, that would be my view. Dan, I think that although physical time could come to an end, that is to say, the kind of time that physicists measure and deal with could come to an end at the end of the universe, it seems to me that metaphysical time, or God's time, could never come to an end, because even if God destroyed the universe, it would still always be true for God that the universe used to exist, that I did do these things. And as long as you've got those past tense truths, there's clearly time. So it seems to me that time can never end once it's created. But I don't think that that's a problem for the existence of an actually infinite number of things, because The future doesn't really exist. It's just pure potentiality. Temporal becoming is real. And on Jimmy Akin's own view of God as simple, God doesn't have a multiplicity of thoughts of the future. God's knowledge is an undivided, simple intuition of all reality. So on Akin's view himself, there is no multiplicity in God, much less infinite multiplicity.
Yeah. So that the time in our reality will come to an end. However, time will continue in a different sense.
I think so. I think so. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, I was just thinking about it. Do you think that that makes is a complication in the objection that he raised and saying that that it could be theologically unfaithful?
It's a complication, but it would be one I think that is quickly overcome by saying that we're talking about, say, God's time or the time of the new heavens and the new earth. There clearly will be time in the new heavens and new earth because we'll have resurrection bodies, and we're not going to be frozen like mannequins or ice statues. It's going to be dynamic. So there will be time in the new heavens and new earth. And the question is, will that go on forever? Well, yes, the Bible says that God so loved the world that whoever believed in him would have everlasting life.
How do you think the function and nature of that time would look like?
I don't know. I mean, it's going to be supernatural, right? I mean, it's supernatural bodies able to transport from one place to another without traversing the distance in between, kind of like teleportation in Star Wars or something. So who knows what that kind of new creation will be like.
Yeah, that was the part that kept me awake at night, trying to think, well, I'm talking to we got Bill Craig tomorrow. He's the time guy. So I don't know, maybe he's got some sort of concept for that one or not.
Yeah.
Well, thank you for that.
Sure.
Nice preview of coming attractions for the spring course on God and Time.
Yes, we've agreed now that the course I teach in February will be on God and Time. So those of you who suggested that, I thank you for your suggestion. We're going to do it.
Will that be online like this as well? Like,
do you know, Dave?
Well, you'll be in person, hopefully, because you'll also be doing the linear. And so if you're here, I still think we can tape it and send it out. I don't see why not. That's what we had been planning on doing with the May course. So my guess is that yes.
I might be slightly devastated if it can't be online, because I probably won't be able to make it in person. Just saying.
Surely, Dave, that there would be the facilities to live stream it, just like this one, right? If I'm in the classroom.
I'm thinking like in May, that's what we'd been planning to do in person. So yeah, I don't see any reason why it wouldn't be.
Well, shall we go to
Nancy Piercy class in the fall? Oh, sorry. Yeah, we did that with a Nancy Piercy class in the fall where she was in person, and we were able to have auditors on Zoom, and it worked pretty well. Good.
Well, let's wrap it up now then with our final chapter. Here I reflect a bit on eschatological concerns on page 364. I say, given the Judeo-Christian doctrine of physical, bodily, eschatological resurrection, it would be disconcerting if Adam and Eve were so different from us in their morphology that they and their immediate descendants would be physically repugnant to the vast majority of the saints. Fortunately, Homo heidelbergensis was not some kind of a hybrid ape man, but was recognizably human. And you see the picture there on page 364 that also graces the cover of the book. My wife, looking at this picture, said, well, I think he's a real handsome dude. So we don't need to be concerned that I'm suggesting Adam and Eve were these monstrous ape men. In fact, I already mentioned that Homo antecessor, a sister species of Homo heidelbergensis, has a remarkably modern facial morphology, and that the differences between Neanderthals and modern humans may well be, in the opinion of many paleoanthropologists, derived characteristics as a result of their adaptation to Ice Age climates. You notice the footnote on page 364. Paleoanthropologists have opined that if a Neanderthal were seen today dressed in a three-piece suit and boarding a subway train in New York, he would not have attracted undue attention. Love that quotation. So when you think about the diversity within the contemporary population, from Australian Aborigines to Nordic Laplanders to Inuits in Canada and Greenland, then I don't think it's so radical, including archaic humans within the human family. I think many of us in the West have a deeply inherited tendency, largely as a result of classical art, to think of Adam and Eve as European Caucasians. And this is obviously nothing more than a cultural and racial prejudice. If we can get used to the idea that Adam and Eve may have resembled African Bushmen more than white people, then surely we can get used to the idea that Adam and Eve looked like Homo heidelbergensis rather than like us. Now, the thought that Neanderthals and other archaic humans might share with us Christians the eschatological state of the new heavens and the new earth brings the startling realization that as members of the human family, Neanderthals, Denisovans, and others were, like us, people whom God loves and for whom Christ died. Paul describes how God, quote, overlooked the times of human ignorance, end quote, Acts 17:30, and, quote, passed over former sins, end quote, committed prior to Christ's advent, Romans 3:23. Christ's death atoned for the sins of past humanity all the way back to Adam's sin. So unless you embrace the strange teaching of limited atonement, Christ's atoning death must therefore have encompassed the sins of these archaic humans. Now, this realization raises the difficult question of the accessibility of salvation for those who, for these archaic humans. But as I point out, this is really the same question for people like Job, who lived outside the orbit of the Old Testament covenant. And any solution to that problem, such as appeal to God's general revelation in nature and conscience, can be applied to Neanderthals and other archaic humans, as well as to people like Job. Then I have this very interesting discussion of the question of the image of God. If Adam and Eve were the ancestors of Neanderthals and other archaic humans, it follows that the members of these species are, like Adam and Eve, made in the image of God. So how should we understand this? Well, in his much acclaimed book, The Liberating Image, the Imago Dei in Genesis 1, Richard Middleton distinguishes between what he calls a substantialistic, a relational, and a functional interpretation of the image of God. Rather than find the image of God in some ontological similarity between God and man, or in man's capacity to stand in I-thou relations with God and other persons, Middleton plumps for a functional interpretation of the Imago Dei. And I quote, on this reading, the Imago Dei designates the royal office or calling of human beings as God's representatives and agents in the world, granted authorized power to share in God's rule or administration of the earth's resources and creatures, end quote. And Middleton reports that today there is a virtual unanimity among Old Testament scholars in favor of this functional interpretation. Nevertheless, I have to say I am unpersuaded. As I point out at the bottom of 366, in the first place, it is far from evident that the royal assignment given by God to man is not a contingent, freely given bequest of God. When you think about it, God could have created a human being without giving him that function or office, just as he could have created the firmament or the heavenly luminaries without giving them the functions that he has assigned to them. So there's nothing about being a human being that requires having that function. We can imagine possible worlds in which God creates human beings, but doesn't give them that function, which shows that it's not of the essence of humanity to have this royal office. Second, and most important, the things having a necessary and inseparable purpose is just not the same thing as a thing's definition. An essential function of an automobile, for example, is to transport people, but that is not the definition of an automobile. The stubborn fact is that Genesis just does not define what is meant by the image and likeness of God. So the key evidence for Middleton's interpretation is his appeal to ancient Near Eastern evidence concerning the way in which kings and the Pharaoh is said to be God's image. And on page 368, I want to read Middleton's comment on these ancient texts. He says, to understand the meaning and function of this idea, we need to grasp something of the wider ideology of kingship in Egypt. Central to this ideology was the divinity of the Pharaoh, by which he was set apart from all other human beings. The notion of the Pharaoh as an image of a god must be understood in this context. In one sense, the notion of image is but one among many other ways of expressing the Pharaoh's divine origin and kinship to the gods. The Pharaoh was thought in a fairly strong sense to be a physical, local incarnation of deity, analogous to that of a cult statue or image of a god, which is also such an incarnation. The king, as the living image of God, was, Curtis explains, like the cult statue, a place where the god manifested himself and was a primary means by which the deity worked on earth. At the bottom of 368, I point out two major flaws which undermine Middleton's case. First, Middleton admits that a functional interpretation does not preclude and even presupposes a substantial interpretation. He writes, and I quote, both functional and relational interpretations of the image are, like substantialistic interpretations, strictly speaking, metaphysical, in that they also make ontological assumptions about human nature. A functional interpretation might be seen as consonant with some version of action theory. The focus is on persons as agents who act responsibly or irresponsibly. Action on this model includes all that an agent does, including thinking as an integral unity, end quote. Well, this undermines Middleton's case for a purely functional interpretation because he recognizes that humanity's function is rooted in ontology. More than that, he says it's rooted in personal agency. And personal agency is not a function. It is a property of personal agents. That is to say, personally, causally effective beings. And notice as well that the relation between ontology and function is asymmetrical. Functions are grounded in ontology, not vice versa. The substantialist is quite happy to recognize that human beings have been created by God to carry out a function. They can carry out that function, however, because of what they are, namely personal agents. So the functional interpretation actually presupposes the substantial interpretation in grounding human function in the ontology of human beings as personal agents. Now, the second flaw in the argument is that the Mesopotamian and Egyptian texts cited do not, in fact, support a functional interpretation, but rather a different fourth interpretation. As Middleton convincingly shows, when the ancient Near Eastern texts speak of an idol or of the pharaoh as a god's image, what they mean is that the idol or the pharaoh embodies or incarnates the god. The deity is present in and lives through the idol or the king. The problem is this isn't a functional interpretation. It is a metaphysical view of the relation between the idol or king and the god. It is more accurate, therefore, to call this an incarnational interpretation. The king is the incarnation of the god. The idol is the embodiment of the god. But then this interpretation is irrelevant to the interpretation of the Genesis texts, for those texts do not think of human beings as incarnations of God, through which he lives and acts in the world. An anti-iconic religion like Judaism would have recoiled at the idea that human beings are embodiments of God. So I think that a substantialistic interpretation is practically unavoidable. Finally, I consider body-soul dualism interactionism. And what I point out here is that the biblical view of human being is that we are body-soul composites. And then I provide some arguments in support of body-soul dualism interactionism. And so the bottom line here of this section would be that a human being is a rational soul in a hominin body. A human being is a rational soul in a hominin body. He's a body-soul composite. So when we were looking earlier at the origins of humanity, and we looked at those cognitive capacities indicative of human behavior, those were evidence of human behavior. They weren't definitional of what a human being is. They were evidence of humanity. But if you want to talk about what a human being is constitutionally, he is a rational soul in a hominin body. And we can look for humanity by looking for those archaeological signatures that indicate modern cognitive capacity. Oh, and then the last section concerns this Adam and Eve's contemporaries. And here, as I've already indicated, the radical transition that effected in the founding pair that lifted them to the human level plausibly involved both biological and spiritual renovation, perhaps divinely caused. Biologically, As we have seen, we can envision a regulatory mutation that radically increases the cognitive capacity of the brain beyond what other hominins enjoy. Such a transformation could equip the organism with the neurological structure to support a rational soul. In that case, Adam would be a case of what genetic engineers call a genetically modified organism. And then I talk about how this could best be understood so that their genes would be transmitted to their descendants. On to page 378. Adam and Eve were thus something radically new. How would Adam and Eve consort then with their non-human contemporaries? We can plausibly conjecture that as bearers of a modern human consciousness and linguistic ability, Adam and Eve would increasingly feel themselves at a distance from their non-human contemporaries, and as their descendants multiplied, their tribe would naturally be inclined to increasingly self-isolate. If there were sexual encounters with non-human hominins, these would be cases of bestiality, contrary to God's will for humanity, though not entirely surprising for a fallen race. Eventually, as Adam and Eve's descendants superseded the other hominin species, the possibility of such liaisons disappears. So on my view, I try to really minimize interbreeding between Adam and Eve and these non-human hominins. And that differentiates the model, again, from the recent genealogical Adam and Eve, which appeals crucially to such interbreeding. Yeah, I'll read this paragraph on 378. So we may envision with Kenneth Kemp an initial population of, say, 5,000 hominins, animals that are in many respects like human beings, but lack the capacity for rational thought. Out of this population, God selects 2 and furnishes them with intellects by renovating their brains and endowing them with rational souls. Only they are therefore truly human. At some point, they become aware of God's moral requirements, which renders them responsible moral agents. Unfortunately, they misuse their free will by choosing to commit the original sin or transgression, thereby becoming morally guilty before God and alienating themselves from God, though not from the offer of God's love and forgiveness. As we've seen from our study of Genesis 3, 1 Corinthians 15, and Romans 5, Adam was thus responsible for introducing spiritual, but not physical, death into the human race, since as biological organisms, Adam and Eve were naturally mortal. We might think it unfair of God not to extend to Adam and Eve's contemporaries the same opportunity of a relationship with God that he bestowed on Adam and Eve. But Kemp effectively exposes the flaw in such thinking, asking, quote, would it not have been unjust of God to give to Adam and Eve the gift of a rational soul, a gift that would make them fully human and immortal, and the additional prospect of eternal happiness with God in heaven, while leaving in an animal state their siblings and cousins, who also, on his account, had a bodily constitution sufficient to sustain rational activity? I think not. God did not owe Adam and Eve's cousins a rational and therefore immortal soul. Indeed, the very idea that God owes an intellectual soul to these cousins risks incoherence. How could God owe it to some being to make it not exist and to make another being exist in its place? I point out that God is under no obligation, for example, to make a chimpanzee not a chimpanzee or a pelican not a pelican. Similarly, he has no obligation to make other beasts into human beings. And I think Kemp's retort is doubly correct if we recognize, as I do, a biological difference between Adam and his progenitors, as it seems we should, because there's nothing unjust about treating animals as animals. So that brings us to the end of our quest of the historical Adam, and a quest that, as I say, is unended and probably unending. But I hope that it's sufficient to show that the existence of a historical Adam and Eve is fully compatible with contemporary science. Any final thoughts?
Okay, Dan.
That last paragraph was fantastic that you read there that tries to put it all together. That's just what I needed. So I love that. My follow-up question is how then, and it's not just related to your model, but any model that is old Earth or theistic evolution or something like that, but how do we understand the fall of man and its impact on the rest of creation? Because it seems to me, as I read like parts in Romans 8 or in Revelation, that the impact of the fall of man is like this idea that it's cosmic. It causes the fall of the whole world, but that doesn't seem at all compatible with this. So I'm just wondering how you what your thoughts are on that.
I do not know, Dan, how to make sense of this sort of cosmic implications of the fall. I don't understand how the fall of Adam and Eve, frankly, even on the traditional model, I mean, never mind mine, I don't understand how they're committing moral evil and bringing sin into the human race would produce these sort of cosmic effects. So I'm not inclined to think of that in a sort of literal way unless somebody can make sense of it for me.
Well, isn't the idea that God curses the creation because of the sin, like cursed is the ground?
Okay. Well, no, if you think of it that way, then that would make sense. And that could be used on my model, that when Adam and Eve sin, they alienate themselves from God, and they are estranged from him now. And in virtue of that, God does something to curse the created order. What that involves physically, I don't know. I mean, I've heard people speculate like maybe the second law of thermodynamics is the result of this. And that's preposterous because you couldn't even live in a world that wasn't governed by the second law. So yes, you could imagine a miraculous cursing. I just don't know wherein that consisted, but yeah, you could do that. Cool. And I want to say as well, the model is perfectly compatible if you want to affirm federal headship of Adam, of the human race, and think that his sin is imputed to all of us, or that there was a corruption of human nature. I just don't think those things are taught in the Bible. And so I don't think those are among our biblical commitments. But if your theology wants to hold to that, that's fine. There's room for it.
It's just the way that I always hear it kind of pitched is you have this idyllic state in Eden.
Yeah.
And then there's the fall.
Yeah.
And then the idea is the return back. But the return back seems like there'll be no death, there'll be no decay. It's renewed creation. But
yeah,
on any progressive or theistic model or whatever evolutionary model, you don't have, when Adam and Eve are around, there's still plenty of death. There's still plenty of suffering and disease. And
yes. Though their existence in the garden was idyllic, I think. It was a paradise. So yeah, that's true. But I don't think that we should think that animal death and predation is the result of the fall.
Great, thanks, Dr. Craig. I'll finish there.
Okay.
All right, Fred.
Quick question, just to see if I'm thinking through this right. Is it right to say sin entered the world through Adam and Eve because they're the first moral agents? So actions that that they would have done sort of before they were humans or their ancestors, that would not have been sinful actions, like, you know, whatever, stealing something or something, because animals can't steal, they can't commit adultery.
It would like be when your dog chews up your your hat or when he pees on the carpet. He's not a moral agent, and so he can't be culpable for those acts.
All right. Michael.
Hi, Dr. Craig.
Hey.
My question was about the speculation about potential interbreeding and bestiality, and just curious if that would commit us, or that would result in some of those offspring being human as well as a fraction being non-human. Like some of the offspring would have a recessive outcropping of the genetics, like not containing the FOXP2 that's related to higher level communication, and some of those I guess sinful offspring would have some of those human traits.
Wow. I mean, you're raising really significant biological questions. I know that Josh Swamidas has struggled with, because his model hinges on interbreeding. And so what happens when a human being copulates with a non-human hominid? Can it sire children? And if so, are the children human or not? I'm not equipped to answer a question like that, but I want to avoid, insofar as I can, postulating that kind of interbreeding and propagation. And I do think it's very plausible that Adam and Eve and their descendants would have resisted such a thing.
Yeah, it seems like to me like it would be possible, but it would be one of those kind of distasteful things that you would hope would not be true and would happen.
Yeah.
Okay.
Whether
Ben.
or not even there it would be fertile, whether there would be something produced, I don't know.
Well, there are 4 more questions, Dr. Craig. I'm not sure if you have time, but Ben is next.
Okay, I was wondering, kind of a fun question. Supposing Genesis was lost to history, or perhaps just Genesis 1 through 11 was lost to history, do you think we could independently affirm the Imago Dei doctrine from New Testament verses like James 3:9, where it says, "With the tongue we bless our Lord and Father, and with it we curse people who have been made in the likeness of God"? There's at least one other one like that.
I've never thought of that, Ben. I mean, given that we have Genesis 1, it seemed like sort of an academic question, but yes, I mean, off the top of my head, it would seem like James would be adequate for that, and that there would be this sort of ontological similarity between God and human beings.
Okay. Aaron.
How about if we take one more question?
All right, Aaron.
Yeah, I'm really interested in the image of God and this whole question. It seems like your analysis of Middleton, I think was who it was, his view is right, that the ontology grounds the function.
Mm-hmm.
But couldn't we still say, for strictly textual reasons, that what the author had in mind was a functional view, and that the substantialistic and relational elements are just implicit in that, but that they weren't the focus of the author or the intention of the author?
I don't think that that's the case, Aaron. If you look at the text, it just doesn't define what image and likeness mean. And I think what one verse counts against the functional interpretation is, I believe it's Genesis 5:1, when it says that Adam bore Seth in his image and likeness. And clearly there, it's not talking about a function that Seth had. It's talking about he was a human being like Adam was. There was this ontological similarity between the two. So while I wouldn't think to deny that God does assign to mankind this royal function, I don't think that it's right to say that is that wherein the image of God consists. Well, I want to thank all of you for this very stimulating and interesting week. And I hope that out of the videotapes, we'll be able to cull some nice clips of interaction with you, and that we'll be able to post these on our Reasonable Faith channel. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Craig.
Thank you, Dr. Craig.
Good evening.
Great day. Okay. Well, guys, feel free to discuss what you would like.
Are you going to be YouTube famous on the Reasonable Faith YouTube channel?
Yay.
I wanted to ask a question. If any of you guys picked up on this, I've been at work today, so unfortunately I've been running around with AirPods on listening. So I might have missed it. But he was talking about the Garden of Eden. On his view, how are we supposed to understand the Garden of Eden, particularly the Tree of Life? Is there a historical tree of life, or how does Eden work in his view? Did anybody pick up?
I think he was pretty clear, Hunter, that there wasn't, like early in the book, that there wasn't any such thing as like a historical tree of life. He considered that to be part of the ancient Near East myth.
I think he said that was a fantastic element, didn't he? I'm checking right now.
Yeah, fantastical element.
Yes.
He certainly thinks that the fruit that gives immortality is a fantastic element. And also, if any old Earth view is going to affirm death, animal death before the fall, so, well, I don't know if that would relate to the Tree of Life, though. Yeah.
Yeah, I was just thinking. I think that how he would answer it would be that there's this the paradise kind of is a symbolic representation of their communion with God. But I just wanted to see if there's anything more to that I missed on.
Actually, I think, and I might have, it's either in his book, he talks a little bit about Eden and the geography of Eden, because, there's references to actual geographical realities like the Tigris and Euphrates and even the other rivers. He investigates that. I didn't follow all the details, but at one part in the book, he says it could be a real geographical location. And I heard him in a separate interview saying that if he had to, he's not sure, but he probably thinks Eden was real. There was a geographical location where man had some sort of intimate fellowship with God. So it doesn't necessarily have to be all symbolic, but I do agree that I think he thinks the tree of life and the fruit and everything are one of the symbolic features.
But I believe in one of the discussions this week, I believe when Dr. Craig was talking about the existence of physical death for humans before the fall, I believe he was also referencing that the existence of the Tree of Life would make sense from that perspective, because it will allow you to sort of replenish your health and then make sense of the concern that God had of providing Adam and Eve access to the Eden and the tree after the fall, so that they wouldn't live forever. So I think, I'm not sure whether has he explicitly said that it was unhistorical, or is it just that it's fantastic and we're more agnostic about the existence of the Tree of Life? I'm not sure.
Was that view that that Dr. Craig had was that Adam being infused with a soul? It's almost like in that Planet of the Apes type of thing, where they get injected with the virus and then suddenly they get like really intelligent type of thing. Is that sort of what he was describing happened? I might have missed the earlier part.
He's a substance dualist, so a soul would be a completely spiritual, not a physical element. I think that's what he meant. Now, there would be physical requirements for being, the body that's connected to a human soul, but I think the soul itself he intends as spiritual only.
But it does mean that prior to Adam, there would have been no souls, right?
Correct.
So I guess with the moment.
Yeah, well, no rational souls. Yeah.
Yeah.
On his view, no rational souls.
Yeah, the term soul biblically is problematic because it's applied to animals sometimes, like the Hebrew word nefesh. So you got to be careful with the word soul.
Yeah, maybe mind would be better, as an immaterial mind.
Yeah, something like that, or spirit. The word for spirit in Hebrew is ruach, which means like wind, and it's the same one in the New Testament. Pneuma also means wind. So it's like something you can't see directly, but you can see the effects of it. So that may be the closest thing in the Bible to immaterial.
I'm sort of interested in just, now that it's the last day, what people's overall thoughts are of the thesis. I'll just throw out real quickly that I think he, as I read through the book and then listened to his presentations, I think he made a very good case for putting it into the genre of myth, or mytho-history. That seems to make sense to me, but unfortunately, where I've got some work to do in thinking through this is, okay, what does that mean? Because again, if it's mytho-history, that doesn't really help you to conclude definitively on whether you interpret it literally or not. And that's where all the problematic issues come up, is interpretation. And one thing I noted is that in the New Testament section of the book, he's very good, and I understand the difference between literary and I forget the other word that's used.
Assertoric and illustrative.
Yes, illustrative and assertive. Yes, exactly. It's the one thing that I'm struggling with is I've got to see more. I've got to understand more and more that the original author, even though he's using a mythical genre about old, ancient, precedent-setting stories that explain things in reality, that's true. But it seems to me that it's hard for me to see that original author didn't have some sort of literal understanding of those stories. And then when you go to the New Testament, every time they see it, you look for it. Oh, maybe I'll get a hint that the New Testament allows me to take this spiritually, like they do many times on prophecy. When New Testament authors do prophecy, they spiritualize it a lot. But every time they refer to these stories in Genesis, it just seems like they're taking the literal aspect of it. Now, that doesn't mean, they don't go into all the details. They never refer like specifically maybe to the tree of life or something. I know it's referred in Revelation, but there's not a lot of hints there. I'm not saying this is a conclusive argument, but they just seem to take it literally. So that's where so at the very minute, I'll end off here. While I agree with Craig's thesis, I'm wondering though that I would almost supplement it with, even though we're dealing with a genre where you have more flexibility to have figurative elements. I think there's got to be a historical core, and it's more so than just the theological teachings that Craig says we can affirm. Obviously, we all agree the theological teachings are there, but like if it's not a flood that does then demolish the whole world, something had to happen where there was a judgment on all humanity and one person survived, or even the Tower of Babel. There had to be some judgment that eventually somehow led to the languages of humanity. It might not be using the details that they used, because some of those seem to be anachronistic, as I think Fred was talking about. But it's pointing back to something that happened, whenever it happened and how it happened. So that's my thoughts on it. I agree with his his genre analysis, but I'm just getting too far away from a literal interpretation is a little difficult for me, especially given New Testament references.
Yeah, I would share similar thoughts than like you, Steve, and specifically on the genre analysis. Maybe my main concern is that we are ultimately talking about societies and literary sources that are way back in the history, and whether we have sort of truly, do we have just so much? Maybe the open question I still have for myself is that, do we still have justification for basing a confident understanding of how those societies and how those literary genres were understood in the original context, because it goes so way back to such a foreign culture and society that we Westerners don't have that much understanding of.
I think it's a really great question, Steve. Thanks for asking. I think that's a good way to kind of wind it up. I think for me, look, this has been a real sort of pet issue for me for a long time, which is why I've been so keen to be in this course. I tend to go a bit further than Dr. Craig, actually. I don't know that I feel like a bad person for even thinking like this, but I wonder whether I feel like it's best understood just as myth, not even mytho-history. Yeah, I think there's all sorts of problems, and like making Adam and Eve Homo heidelbergensis, and like I was, cosmic fall, and the idea of a cosmic fall. What, like, how does that work? And I think Dr. Craig has sort of said, I don't even know. Like, I don't know if that's how I sort of heard him answering that. And don't know. I think you got to do all sorts of weird things, like infusing a soul at a particular point in time. That feels kind of weird. What do you do with Adam and Eve's siblings? Or like, were they wandering around as the only two humans, but members of this very similar species? And I feel like you got to do all these it raises all these weird questions, and I wonder whether it just kind of almost easier to think of the genre as myth and maybe bite the bullet a little bit and adjust doctrine of inspiration, which sounds a little bit radical, but I almost heard Dr. Craig is saying that there could actually even be some benefits or advantages to that in the way that we understand the two natures of Christ. So I don't know. I'm definitely not strong on it, right? But that's probably where I tend to lean. I'd love to hear where other people are going too.
I think it's just aliens.
No, I'm not saying it was aliens. It was aliens.
Hey guys, I got to roll, but it was nice kind of semi-meeting all of you.
Yes. See you, Fred.
Yeah, take it easy, Fred.
No,
I gotta
go ahead.
I was just gonna say, in my thinking, it seems like it's pretty much good enough as far as the science is concerned to just lay out some plausible options. And I think I would like to have a great deal of precision, but I'm pretty much okay with saying there's space. There could be 2 or 3 different options that are plausible. Maybe when we talk about the infusion of a soul and things like that, I'm willing to just kind of go, I don't know, but there's a handful of plausible options, and that's good enough for me. I guess what I really want is a good enough response to do away with the hard problems. And for me, the genre analysis is good enough to do that. So I feel pretty good. I
think you're onto something, Aaron, with that, because I'm by no means an expert, but this is what I do all day long. Is not all day long. That's but that's a little much. But when I'm interacting with college students as a Ratio Christi missionary, I think it's really important to acknowledge the teleological argument when it comes to creation, and have if I'm using this word right, like an abductive argument for things like this, because at the end of the day, this is like eschatology. It's the beginning and it's the end. We won't really know. I'm sure. I tend toward young Earth creation for sure, but I'm sure young Earth creationists are going to be wrong about something. I'm sure old Earth creation scientists are going to be wrong about something, and when we get to heaven, we'll figure this kind of stuff out. But like you said, Aaron, I think it's good to have 3 or 4 different things in your pocket to talk about when you're talking about people, because I heard one apologist say one time, the goal for an apologist is not necessarily convert people on site, but it is to draw people a little bit closer and a little bit closer and a little bit closer. And for me, this was a big thing coming out of a secular environment, being an atheist till I was 26, becoming a Christian. I felt like it's something I really needed to get settled in my own life. And I did err on the side of creation science because I think it best explains like a literal interpretation of the Bible, and also that I don't know that fallen man could ever do any better to explain it either. That's just that's just where I'm at with it. I don't think my position changed any, but at least it's given me a lot more conversation when I talk to people, and I do appreciate William Lane Craig's seriousness to defend the validity of the Bible, even though in a sense it's like, does it really defend the validity of the Bible? I don't know. Like when you start saying mytho-history, it is difficult, but it's at the same time, I don't know that it's something that like a lot of us at Radio Christi, I've heard us say like, it's not a hill I'm willing to die on anyway. But if the conversation comes up, now I've got something else to say to it, and I always preface that with like, I might not necessarily agree with this, but I heard one person say and then lay out Craig's defense, and it's like, I don't necessarily agree with this either, but Stephen C. Meyer said, and then lay out that, and just keep on going.
I think it removes a barrier. I think that's one thing that we can say. If somebody is so struggling with Christianity that they can't intellectually, for some reason, they just can't get over the hump because of the problems in Genesis 1-11, problems, then I think this might be enough for somebody to say, well, if that's possible, maybe I'm willing to consider the gospel. And I really think that is Craig's heart in this.
Yeah.
He's trying to remove barriers.
Well,
I think
and
that's true.
Yeah, I do too. And most of the presuppositional approaches that I've been familiar with, they don't take that into consideration. It's almost like, well, you don't believe the Bible, you can just go to hell then with everybody else that doesn't believe the Bible. And it's just like,
yeah, that's so
I'm
unhelpful.
sure we can do better than that.
Well, I'll just throw some 2 cents in. Wanted to echo kind of what Bill and Leonard were just saying. I'm auditing and I'm not pursuing a master's or PhD. I work in freight logistics and have a job, but my boss.
Good for you, Michael. I'm glad that you're taking this because you'll use this probably like a lot. So,
oh, thank you. I love William Lane Craig, and I've really enjoyed the opportunity listening to all of your objections and contributions. And my boss has a son-in-law who's, often described as a goofy fundamentalist Christian, young earth creationist. And I guess my thoughts is the idea of letting 1,000 flowers bloom and understanding what the flexibility and optionality is, interpreting scripture. And I think Craig mentions it early on, but unless the view is that Adam was purely mythological or fictional, that might call into some question the fall of man and why would we need the atonement. But if there's a historical core to Adam being a real person in history, I like that Craig has covered this and popularized a view that I guess that way I would phrase it is like in Craig's debates, it lowers the intellectual price tag for people like my boss that I interact with daily and pray for, that he would, what's necessary for him to view Christianity as palatable and acceptable. And if something like incorporating what he thinks science says about the world is compatible with Christianity, I love that there's an intellectual scholar like Craig that's putting forth a position in addition to young earth creationist perspectives that people want to hold to, and the fact that this may not be a core doctrine insofar as like the essential elements of the faith. So that's kind of my 2 cents.
I just want to clarify, maybe because I'm kind of a disagreeable person, but I think the project of trying to make room for various plausible ideas is good enough for me with respect to the science and attempts to, identify where in history Adam was, those kind of questions. I do want a lot more precision when it comes to the hermeneutical questions, things like that. That's really important to me. And I think that Dr. Craig has done that mostly to my satisfaction. There's still ambiguity around questions like exactly what elements, to take as figurative, the Tree of Life, Garden of Eden. But I think he's been pretty clear about the big ones, and so I feel good about that. I mean, I don't know what to think about, the garden or things like that, but I'm okay with that because I don't think anything important hinges on that. And I feel good about where to stand on Adam, 'cause that's a big issue. But when it comes to like the science, part of me wants to shrug and say, Homo heidelbergensis could be, but with the hermeneutical questions, I definitely want a little bit more precision, at least on the big issues. So.
And I just wanted to kind of echo a thought that's been said, and I know Dr. Craig talks about, he's an advocate for mere Christianity, and he wants to, the language he's used, he wants to lower the bar as far as possible so it's easy for someone to step over, as Leonard was sort of saying, and consider the gospel. And I just want to say, in my experience, that is so true. If we want to, we can't laden Christianity with more than what is the basics for people. I mean, they can be secondary conversations that we have later. And so I love this idea of saying, here are some acceptable options that you can take. And I think that's powerful. I did want to ask people just a question about the application of this in, say, the application of this in the context of church or something like that. Do you think in your experiences that there is much interest? I mean, are these the sorts of conversations that the people want to have? Or is this more of a, theology nerd kind of thing? Or, do you know what I mean? Like, is this the sort of thing the average? Because in my experience, most people aren't interested in talking about this sort of stuff.
I agree. Also, I would say in my experience, that's the case as well.
Yeah, I'm a full-time evangelist. I've spoke all over the country last summer. I will tell you, as far as apologetics go, this is on its way out because in the West, atheism is on its way out. And it was scientific atheists that really were the fight for this. The God delusion, especially, spurred a lot of this. The biggest apologetic battles right now are over the image of God, though, and especially in relation to critical race theory and LGBTQ issues. Those are the two biggest questions I got over and over and over again from Alaska to Florida last year. It was just didn't matter where I went in the United States. I always got asked that question. I always had a transgender kid in the youth group or something. It's just that's part of like. So now it's that, and scientific atheism is on its way out from my perspective.
From my perspective, it's this book represents my personal life, basically. That I had a crisis of faith when I was fairly new in the faith, and things like the age of the earth was a huge problem to me. The existence of dinosaurs and so on and so forth. And everybody I asked at my church, in the pastoral staff, said, "Don't think about it, just believe."
Yeah.
And that was useless. That was absolutely useless. It didn't help at all. Didn't
A
help
lot
at
of
all.
people who have that experience end up rejecting the faith. I've heard that story so many
Yes.
times.
I had a guy that worked for me when I was a manager who went through that. He had gone to Biola, gotten a degree, and then when these questions couldn't be answered to his satisfaction, he just gave up on Christianity, just quit.
There you go, Rick. Oldie but a goodie.
I read every word of all of those. That's where I started. I did.
Yeah, he wouldn't agree with that statement at all.
It was critical to me personally. Of course, that was, 45, 50 years ago. So I guess things have changed. Hearing what you said, Bill, is a little spooky to me because I'm not sure how I would handle those two issues that you say are everything out there. And I can see that you're right. As I listen to podcasts and so on, and what my kids are telling me, and so on. I can see that you're right. Those two issues are the hot topics.
They're huge. They're huge.
I think
My issue is nothing nowadays.
Dan, can I ask you a question? Are those major issues that you see in your part of the world? Because my instinct is to say that those are major American issues that sort of live on the border of religion and politics.
In my part of the world, being a Christian is ridiculous. Like, it's a bit ridiculous. There's a great little. I'll pop this website in the chat. It's this Christian commentator. He's Australian. His name's Stephen McAlpine, and he's written a book called "Being the Bad Guys," and he talks about how Christians. And this is my experience growing up. Christians are kind of viewed as these people who are kind of moralistic, but like super moral people. But they're super moral, but sort of weird, but moral. Now it's kind of just flipped, and Christians are actually dangerous and bad for their views, because like the gender, sexuality, they are massive issues here. People here are not very contemplative. I don't know if it's different to the rest of the world, right? But they're not very contemplative about Christianity and worldview. They just kind of assume worldview, have an assumed one, which is basically Christian in the sense that all people are valuable. Like, that's just assumed, right? Atheism isn't that strong. It's just a weird, incoherent mishmash is honestly how I would sort of describe it. But yeah, gender and sexuality are massive, and Christians are just so on the out. And to be like, we just had a new premier for our state come into power, right? The last one resigned. He was appointed. I don't know what you call your state leader, governor, kind of probably the equivalent. And he's a Catholic, pretty serious guy. He actually lived just around the corner from me, grew up just around the corner. He's pretty serious Catholic. And the fear in the media that we've got this radical Catholic now in power who's going to overturn abortion. Like, abortion's like completely legal here. Go for it, cut loose. It's never been an issue. It's never discussed. It's like, of course, obviously, go for abortion. And so, yeah, just the fear in the media about a Christian in power. So yeah, I don't know, it's a long answer to your question, but it's a
That was helpful. Yeah.
weird place to be in some ways. And so it's interesting. Like, I had a friend who lived in Tennessee for quite a long time, and he's Australian but lived there, and he married a girl from Texas. And he said it's very different, because over there, here he's considered like extreme right wing, like a right wing conservative. He went to America, he said they're calling me a communist. So it's just a different environment, but similar issues. Maybe what you have to look forward to.
We're on our way there, brother. And I'll tell you, like, as fast as we can go too. I forgot to mention one thing. The religion of America is basically New Age too. I found that out pretty hard. Like, I've never seen so many people this summer carrying around gemstones around their neck, big hip pouches of rocks. Like, one bartender in St. Louis, not St. Louis, Kansas City, she had a big, and she was like, well, it keeps me centered to have all that. She's got like 2 pounds of gemstones hanging off her hip. And you're like, wow, it's unbelievable. I mean, it's like straight up New Age. It's unashamed New Age, like, centering your chi around all these rocks and precious stones. It's a
personal religion. My sister reads the Urantia book. I'm not sure y'all have ever read that, but nobody knows who the author is. Very mystical, and it allows her to craft her own personal religion. I've been praying for her and talking to her, but it's like Craig's moral argument. Do objective morals and duty, or moral values and duties, exist or not?
Yeah.
And they want to affirm much of what a lot of people call the Judeo-Christian worldview, but it really boils down to a lot of these contradictions, and if you listen to Mike Winger or even William Lane Craig talks about, feminism versus the transgender people, if you really boil it down, there's an inherent contradiction between what people want to affirm, and it's sad, and I'm dealing with it with my own family, and I wish my sister, the historical evidence of how the Bible came to us versus this book that no one knows the author about and affirms all these interdimensional aliens and things. And I'm like, how do you get to a point where you're committed to that versus, I realize to this audience that sounds ridiculous, but I mean, it's my family, and how do you, love somebody at every Christmas that I see my sister? It's, anyway, I'm just, Bill, yeah, I affirm what you're saying. That's definitely a problem that's cropping up.
It's postmodernism in religious form. That there's, that you say there's contradictions. I guarantee if you talk to your sister long enough, she doesn't believe contradictions even exist. I mean,
well, folks, I suppose
10 more
it's
minutes.
time.
10 more minutes. 20 more minutes.
So, all good things must come to an end.
Yeah. This has been great. Listen, I made a list of emails for you guys that sent, and I'm going to try to, for some reason my email wouldn't take it, but I'm going to send it to, I'll tell you what I'll do is I'll send it to Dr. Baggett, and Dr. Baggett, could you just send them out to the class and you guys just email each other? We'll just.
Because I haven't been able to copy them down, so I appreciate that. If somebody could just send them out, so I'm trying
Sure thing. It would be easy if I just sent the whole list to everybody, but some might not want it. So if anybody wants to make sure that I don't include yours in that, let me know.
I just copied the emails that were on the chat.
Right, but I could send the full list. I'd be happy to, but I just want to get anyone upset.
Doesn't the chat auto transcribe or something? Don't you automatically get a transcription of the chat?
Yeah.
I think so. I think you do. Well, anyway, one way or another, we'll distribute that. That's great. Keep in touch. That's terrific. I enjoyed you all so much. A marvelous conversation. It was a delight to meet you all. And God bless you.
Thank you, Dr. Baggett.
Thanks,
Dr. Baggett.
Baggett.
Thanks, Dave.
Thank you.
See you guys.